Hi, I'm Joel H. Brewster, and I'm no stranger to horror. And this is a podcast celebrating modern horror in its finest form. And along the way, I'll be hoping to change you from being a casual horror fan to a horror enthusiast as well. Just a bit about myself. I'm a screenwriter as well as a blogger for the website West Coast Strange, where I'm a sole creator of that. I am also running the West Coast Strange Facebook page, which celebrates both horror and science fiction and anything else odd. Today we'll be talking about one of modern horror's standout remakes, and that is the film Evil Dead, which is a remake of the 1981 film The Evil Dead. It switched its tone from the more comedic and more campy style and went for a rawness and a very bleak sort of look in modern horror, which to some fans was too far of a deviation from the original, but for me, it was absolutely perfect. To discuss this movie, I will be interviewing and speaking with Fletcher Donovan, who is an actor living in Vancouver. He's been in such things as The Man in High Castle and Supernatural. And he is very passionate about this movie as much as I am. We are both big fans of this modern horror classic that somewhat stands out now as a test of time, even though it only came out less than a decade ago. And we'll be discussing its differences from the original, but also just its merit in the genre itself. Fletcher, hello. How are you doing today?
I'm great, Joel. Thanks for having me on the podcast. Much appreciated.
Well, thank you for deciding to be on here. This is awesome. We're both going to be talking about the movie Evil Dead, which is the remake to the film The Evil Dead. There's quite a bit of a deviation from the two films, I'd say, which worked for some horror fans, didn't work for others. But we're quite excited to talk about this because it's a very good modern horror in a sense of its gore and its story that was a little more of a darker tone, but it works in a way that it was darker, but at the same time, some of the violence in this film, when we were briefly discussing before we started this, is so over the top, but in like the best way possible. It makes it like a fun watch. Fletcher, tell me a little about yourself a little more. Tell everyone about yourself a little more, and then we can dive more into this.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Fletcher Donovan. I currently live in Vancouver, British Columbia, pursuing a career in film and television as an actor. I was born in Toronto, had a pretty sort of nomadic mom, so I was moving all over the country, lived sort of on both sides of the coasts. So I grew up part of my life in BC and part of it back in Ontario. Took an interest in acting, I think, when my mom just sort of shoved me into a showing of Anne of Green Gables when I was like probably 6 years old. And kind of like Jim Carrey and the Cable Guy, a lot of my learning and a lot of a lot of the parenting air quote that I received was through the old tube. So it was only natural that I fell in love with cinema and storytelling through that medium.
What sort of stuff did you grow up watching? Like, was it horror, sci-fi? What sort of stuff was there?
It was really cool because I had such a mix of influences. I was always getting pawned off with some family member or a godparent, and actually, it's funny that you ask what I grew up with, because in the last month, I've reconnected with my godfather who lives in Nova Scotia. And one of the things that him and I did when I visited him in this cool sort of garage he turned into an apartment in downtown Toronto was that we would order takeout and we'd watch movies. The movies that probably stuck out the most for me when I was that age, so really, really young, like sort of 5 onwards, were Total Recall, the original, Johnny Mnemonic, Child's Play, Troll, Leprechaun. Like he was sort of the textbook, like kind of like bad influence uncle. It was fair game with what we watched. And so to answer your question in a sort of roundabout way, I didn't grow up with anything in particular. I was lucky to have a bit of everything.
Yeah. And from that, like, what sort of films did like interest you the most to like read scripts for? Like, was it more of that the campier style of like a Leprechaun or in Child's Play? Was it more of the strangeness and the sci-fi of Johnny Mnemonic? Would you like to be in like the remake of that? If they remade that movie, now, because I feel like they remake movies that are like, oh, this movie is so successful. Like Evil Dead is a good example of like
Yeah,
a
yeah, yeah.
successful movie that they remade. But Johnny Mnemonic didn't. I loved it, but it was like one of those movies that didn't capture audience's mouth. But it's a cult classic now. Would that be a role that
Yeah,
would just?
yeah. I mean, I would happily step into Keanu Reeves's shoes for a Johnny Mnemonic reboot. Yeah, I feel like that movie was maybe too ahead of its time. I feel
Yeah,
like if Johnny Mnemonic came out after The Matrix,
yeah,
like I feel like the first Matrix did a good job of sort of blowing people's minds and also shifting cinema into um, transitioning into a more sort of wild and grandiose version of storytelling that
yeah.
now is just kind of like widely accepted, with movies like Inception and stuff like that. We don't really question that stuff.
And I think that, like, yeah, like I was saying, remakes and in general, they seem to get kind of dropped on. Like a lot of people don't really like remakes of good movies, right? So that was a problem with The Evil Dead. Was a good example of that. Is the original film was such a popular one that people didn't want to see the change of it. And I do
Mm-hmm.
feel like a film like Johnny Mnemonic, or a film that didn't was a little ahead of its time, that'd be a better version remake. But in discussion of this film, it worked out as a remake, I think, because it was so, for horror fans that did like it, it worked out because it was a nice deviation from how the original one kind of was, in my opinion.
Yeah, I love that they pulled sort of a lot of the classic kind of iconography of the first one. The chainsaw, the sawed-off shotgun, the like cutting off of the arm, albeit like different circumstances, and like the arm wasn't like running around afterwards.
Yeah.
Or I also liked, even though like it sounds weird, I'm kind of I'm making myself out to be weird. The sort of weird phallic vines that were also in the original.
Yes. That was one thing I noticed too, like that in the original one, how they, because I watched these back to back again just to kind of go over it. In the
Mm-hmm,
original one, I felt like when I watched that, it was an 80s movie, but I felt like
mm-hmm,
dirtier when I watched that scene. I was like, oh, that scene was just like, it was really like done in a way that was like extra pervy. This way, in the new one, I thought when they did that, it was just so horrifying. It was claustrophobic. When she like climbed through the branches, they wrapped around her and everything like that. From that whole scene of from where she like crashed the car until when the
mm-hmm,
branches wrapped around her was just so claustrophobic that when the branches went up her, it was just so,
mm-hmm.
and just in addition to everything else, that was just a horrifying series of events that led up to that.
Yeah, the original one definitely had a weird kind of more sort of pornographic vibe to it. Like the
Yeah.
first one, maybe it's because like it's shot on film and like all the old school like porn videos were shot on that too. And it was
Yeah.
also played up to be more weirdly erotic gone wrong. Because isn't it like her and her partner are fooling around in the bush and then it happens?
No, she just leaves the house, I believe, and then she then the branches itself gets caught on her. But what was really weird about the movie when I rewatched it now is because now I've like, I've seen it like years past, and now I rewatched it, and without knowing like the stuff that I do know about the original, what I found weird was the relationships. It was hard to remember
Mm-hmm,
who was like friends with who and who was dating
mm-hmm,
who. And this one, it was like in the new one, it was like very clear. It's like we're back for the sister who's struggling with drug addiction, which like
mm-hmm,
really worked out in terms of the story.
mm-hmm.
And like you could tell which friend was who, and there was a weird dynamic that like they haven't spoken to the brother in a very long time. But the original one, I was like, okay, who's dating who? That's his sister. Okay, but and it's a classic film, so I know who they are. But I'm like, if I
Yeah.
went into it blind, it would have been hard to kind of follow in that sense. I thought that was one thing that the director of the new one, Fede Alvarez, really improved upon, was just defining the relationships in 2 seconds. There's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
exposition, but he did it really well. He's like, hey, this person's this person. The script pretty much yelled out who each person was, but it
Mm-hmm.
works because it's a cabin in the woods story.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting because I I definitely was more receptive to like jump scares and the general kind of like creepy tone of films and scary television back in the day. Before we were chatting, before we started recording, I was mentioning how I was chuckling a lot while I rewatched the the original Evil Dead,
Yeah,
and I think it's because I hit capacity with like fear when I
yeah,
was really little. I'm talking like therapy fear because I was like, no,
yeah.
like no joke. The one that really pushed me over the edge was an X-Files episode.
Oh,
And
really?
so X-Files was like big between me and my stepbrother as a kid. And had I known what I know now, I would have just been, man, go to bed. It's
Yeah.
like drugs, you know. It's like smoking weed. You
Yeah.
know, had I known what I know now, I would have said, man, just wait until you're 19 and you don't have a mushy brain that's like trying to develop. I'd say the same thing about scary shit. Just wait a bit, man, because you're gonna terrify yourself. But in hindsight, like the positive is that I'm pretty bulletproof now as far as scary movies go.
Yeah.
But there was period where all I watched was scary stuff. And like I said, I think I just spooked that out of myself.
Yeah.
And I find that in order for me to have a lasting sort of impact as far as mobilizing fear in me, the storytelling has to be like so nuanced that I'm thinking about it afterwards. Like
Yeah.
that it has to be so subtle that it's scaring me past the actual film. That's when I get scared now.
Yeah, and that's what as a more of a horror enthusiast myself here, when I watched it too, what I liked about this movie is I feel that if you're a casual horror fan, it would horrify you. But if you're a person that's grew up in horror and like and you're just like a
Mm-hmm.
big horror fan, I felt like that this movie was just a fun homage in that way. Like I'm like it
Totally.
has all the elements of like an 80s style movie that if you're just like watching it as a like a casual horror fan, then there's scenes that you can't unsee in this movie, and it's like a
Mm-hmm.
very painful movie to watch. Like myself and like you, when I watched this, I was just like, this is just fun. This is just like everything was fun. Like I felt like a sadist, like watching like it was just painful scenes back to back. Then I'm like, oh yeah, it was just a fun watch, but like things would happen. I'm like, this is just made for horror fans. And that's one thing I didn't understand why a lot of people, because obviously there's the school of thought that remakes should never be done. And there was a lot of people that didn't like this one. And I just didn't get that because I'm like, it was fun. Like, I don't understand like how a lot of people didn't see it as being a fun movie.
Yeah, I think that people expect when you remake something like Evil Dead that it's got to be like wildly different and like paradigm shifting. And I'd say what I enjoyed about the Evil Dead remake was that they pulled so much of the elements from the previous one, but managed to like reinterpret them in a kind of a fresh way. Like
Yeah.
I loved that all of the violence was like really grandiose,
Yeah.
just like in the first one with blood squirting, and that's the point, right? That's the point. I think that sort of vintage of horror, it was the birth of the really early days of cosmetic makeup, practical effects, and stuff like that. And I felt like there was like a cool fusion of that vibe
Yeah.
with the new storytelling and even with the acting too. I'm somebody that has a hard time not picking apart the acting. And it took me a little bit to realize that, oh, this is probably from the director being acted like this in a
Yeah.
lot of ways to emulate the early style of that film as well, too,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, because one of the most impressive things I think from this movie, I thought like the the acting was in a campy or sort of style in a lot of the parts, but the one thing that really stood out is Jane Levy, that played Mia, kind of the main girl. I thought she was like a fascinating character because she
Mm-hmm.
plays both the damsel sort of in the beginning of the film, and then like
Mm-hmm.
in a sense that like everyone's there to kind of save her, and then by the end of the film, she's also the final girl. So it's such a interesting like shift
Mm-hmm.
of a character, but also that a thing that I found fascinating about her as a final girl was in classic horror films, final girls are usually this like pretty innocent virgins, and they were just there like in this film to help her get over a drug addiction that killed her like earlier in her life. And they're like, yeah, it's a pretty serious drug addiction where she's died
Yeah.
before. We have to really do this. And I was like, that's such an interesting take on a final girl. And then the steps she went on, and then like the depth they had in there was so different than, especially compared to 80s films. In 80s film, you don't even really get development of who these characters are. It was like, hey, they're just some kids getting away. In this one, it
Mm-hmm.
was, hey, this brother was supposed to help out with his sister and their sick mom, but she didn't help out, and then he went away. I'm like, that was such a weirdly deep thing that was thrown in like 2 seconds into the movie. It was referenced throughout the film, but it was done in such a way that, yeah, it was like, oh, we know everything we need to know about the characters and their relationships. And I thought that was she acted off that very really well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for me personally, I thought Mia was great, but I thought for me the standout performance was what's his name? Lou Taylor Pucci, the guy who plays Eric, the long the kind of nerdy
Yes.
dude.
Yeah.
I thought he was fantastic. He kind of seemed to exist on his own in that movie. I felt maybe him and Mia were maybe more believable. They
Yeah.
were kind of more understated, and that's what I enjoyed about it. Whereas the
Yeah.
other ones seemed to be more of the sort of within the vein of like that more campy style horror film acting.
Especially the girlfriend who had a great scene when she chopped off her own arm. But yeah,
Yeah,
I felt like she would be interchangeable from being in the 80s film
yeah,
or this film. You could have put her in
yeah,
either and it worked out, but like
yeah,
she was especially like that. But yeah, it was Eric. I want to say his name was, yeah.
yeah, yeah.
He
Eric,
was, yeah, he was really, really good.
it's fantastic. It was
Really,
just
really
like
good.
really, really believable emotionality, and like I believed him when he was afraid. I also loved, when he's propped up against the wall and he's having a laugh. He's just been nail gunned like
Yes. Yeah.
19 times, and
Yeah.
he's sitting there with that man, you gotta burn your sister kind of
Yeah.
insane cackle in the and then of course him being the unsung hero in the film, he ends up just stabbing Mia's brother right at the
Yeah.
end there, and
Yeah.
totally turning tables there.
He was fascinating. And another great scene for him. First, the bathroom scene where like he had to kill his girlfriend. One thing I will say to every single actor in this was the reaction they had on their faces to pain. Jeez, I thought every actor pulled off pain very well. Like that was like
For
one thing I
sure.
was like, oh, it was believable. I'm like, that was one thing that was believable throughout every single actor was how much pain they looked like they were in. I was like, this looks like it was a brutal time. Obviously, it wasn't. They weren't getting their arms ripped off, but like it seemed very believable throughout the
Mm,
film.
I would agree. There was
One
some
thing
real
I
pain.
love too, and one thing I noticed from this film as opposed to the original is how fast it starts. It's in the first 4 minutes, I believe, is like the first act of like, well, the first 2 minutes of first act of violence, and like the first
Mm,
kill is in like the first 5 minutes or something like that. It's like what a very jarring opening scene with the exorcism with
mhm,
the girl that gets burnt on fire. Slight
mhm.
spoiler alert! If the movie's been out for 7 years, hopefully you've seen it by
we've
now.
been we've been
We've been
spoiling this
spoiling this whole
whole
time. Yeah,
podcast.
I was planning not to like just spoil, but the whole thing is like, if you've seen the movie, you should. Yeah, I think you'll enjoy more if you've seen the movie. But even if you actually haven't seen this movie, it's one of those things that if it's spoiled for you, even if you know everything going into it, visually you still have to see it. It doesn't really
Yeah,
matter if you know that everything's spoiled for you. When you actually still see this movie, it's one of those visual movies that works out that way.
I would say that's where this movie is at its strongest. The cinematography and the scoring as well.
Yes.
There's really brilliant scoring. I'd say that that's really what that movie has going for it most. Is like some of the shots are really
Yeah.
fantastic. I wouldn't say that it's a movie that's shrouded in like mystery. It's pretty standard fare as far as like horror goes. And also, if you've
Absolutely.
seen the original one, there's some very big foreshadowing. But to me, that it wasn't trying to be mysterious. It
Yeah.
was very much an homage to that early film. But yeah, I think visually that's probably one of the best parts, and the scoring of it. There's some great, the foley and stuff like that throughout the movie, and some of the like the piano score at the beginning when the drone shot of the SUV driving
Yeah.
down the road, and it's that really awesome kind of like Hitchcock style piano score.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
It was cool. It was a horror movie that really took itself seriously. It's fun. It's such a fascinating film because it takes itself very seriously at some part, like you said, like the cinematography and the scoring and everything like that. And then at the same time, like some of the violence doesn't take itself as serious. Like obviously, that's not how bodies like work when limbs get cut or whatever, or even just like the durability of every single character in this film. They would be war vets. They like have they go through the ringer. I'm like, you'd be a war vet. There's no way you could be that durable. And it was funny to, well, not funny. One thing I found very interesting about it was, and obviously a very beautiful cast of young actors that just got so ugly by the end of it from the things that actually happened to them, which I thought was like a really cool thing. Because usually in a lot of horror movies now, they have just jump scares. So like the pretty person doesn't have anything happen to them, or they get cut on the arm, so they can just bandage it up, and then that's it for the pretty person. But in this, people were like got their faces chopped off, and they did
Mhm.
whatever to look as
Ugh.
viciously cruel and ugly as possible. And I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's so many ways that like horror films can be a vehicle for a story, and obviously the Evil Dead remake is very much like a very specific way of doing that. I've become really fond of modern horror films. Let the Right One In, the Swedish
Great
version,
movie.
if you've ever seen it.
Yep,
I
I've
think
seen them
that
both.
movie is not only one of the best love stories of all times,
Yeah.
of all time, it's also one of the best low-key horror films too, like
Yeah.
vampire films. And I
Oh, it's
love
one of my
when
favorite
like
vampire films.
yeah, it's so great. But yeah, like that's a very different. I think a lot of people jump into like horror films or many different films for that matter, maybe a little too narrow-minded to begin with. They're like, oh, this is going to be one of those.
Yeah.
But I don't think the creators of the Evil Dead or the creators of Let the Right One In, I don't think they'd go to bat with some of these arguments. Like they're very
Yeah.
much supposed to be one thing. The violence that's not in Let the Right One In, that's in Evil Dead. Those are two very different stylistically, very different ways of telling a story, right? So
Yeah, they are. And the one thing I do find that they have in common that I liked about both of them was the love story that takes place in them, both of the films. In Let the Right One In, the love story is between, like, obviously between the little boy and the vampire girl. And the sense that, like, the love is, like, between more of a friendship and the
mhm,
kinship. And then in the Evil Dead remake, what I liked was the love story was between, like, friends who got a friend clean, which was a
mhm,
very interesting, like, that was what the love story, and a brother and a sister. And it was like, first it was like the friends all together that have obviously been apart for a bit to get Mia clean, but also like the brother and the sister that have had their problems. And that was a love story,
mhm.
as opposed to like a lot of, let's say, 80% of horror movies. That is a random stat. If you're listening to this, please do not email me and say that's a wrong number. I'm aware. I'm aware. I just threw the number 80% out there. But the thing is, most love stories in horror movies are between like a new couple, right? And that's a very interesting thing because it's like a new couple, and then that's the whole love story of the do or die, or a married couple that's failing, or whatever it is. But this one was very platonic, and I think that works for a lot of my favorite movies, like the friendship angle or like the family angle to as a love story as opposed to a romantic one. I think it just makes for a more interesting film.
Yeah, I think it's easier to capture people's attention, like without being more nuanced when it's like a romantic thing.
Hmm.
But I think that the more sort of threads of human life that you can weave into a story, especially when it's horror, especially when it's horror or it's an action film, anything that you can easily capture somebody's attention with, like a jump scare or an explosion or a fucking transformer or whatever it is,
Yeah.
that to me is in many ways the way that films have changed. And I think there's been a big compromise, is that back in the day, most people weren't going to believe that sock puppet thing that was chasing after you. So like they relied on like really rich storytelling. And you see the same thing with video games. Video games back in the day were impossible to
Yeah.
beat. Not to mention, if you shut it off, you had to start over.
Yeah.
But then you fast forward like 20 years, and now you can capture people's attention much more easily without a story, right? Like, and
Hmm.
that's why you find a lot of films that are just sort of filled with pretty faces, but there's nothing really backing it, right?
Yeah, and another fascinating thing about speaking about back in the day is that there was an originality element. Like a lot of, not even to say there's not original films now. There's a lot of original films now. I'm not going to be a person that
Mm-hmm.
says otherwise, but the stance is that there was such a new, well, there wasn't as much content. So because of the originality of some of the films that are coming out, like Gremlins is a good example, we let a lot slide too. Like I feel like if you watch like a film like Gremlins, or if you watch like a film like Evil Dead, or if you watch like a lot of older 80s or even 90s films, or even go back further, that
Ernest Scared Stupid.
classic films. Yeah. If you watch a lot of the originality, allows them to do a lot more. Like Gremlins is a good example because in that movie, there's so many questions you actually have to ask. Like that's a talking animal he brings home. Like in Gremlins, right? Audiences now would be mad about that. They'd be like, wait, you what? What species is that? It's a talking animal. You have like 1,000 questions because we're so filled with content. But because that was
Mm-hmm.
such an original movie of its time, where it's like, oh yeah, okay, well, we can follow this. That's fine. We don't have to ask the questions of why this talking animal doesn't feed it. You can't feed it after midnight, or what sick, the weird rules there, because it was such an original story of its time. And now I feel like a lot of the films that we get don't have that originalities, or a lot of the heart behind them in some contexts, that we ask too many questions in some ways, but also we're just not as wowed as we were once upon a time too.
Yeah, I think it's probably harder to scare kids now. The level of exposure that kids are used to now.
Yeah,
The world is ultimately, I think, a more terrifying place now, not by virtue of it actually being more terrifying,
yeah,
but because the ways in which the world is scary, the ways in which films are scary, the content that we find scary is so much more widespread with the internet. You know what I mean?
yeah,
Like even I can remember when around the birth of the internet, everything just kind of like expands so rapidly,
yeah,
and kids have access to that, like a surplus of it now. That whereas nobody would have ever seen a Gremlin. They might have seen a Gremlins movie poster back in the day.
yes,
They might have seen a Gremlins plush doll, but they wouldn't have been able to go on the computer and watch like a scene from it and be like, "Oh, that's not so scary." Or
yeah,
and you don't have all these other things sort of out in the periphery that maybe would have like desensitized you to it a bit more, if
yeah.
that makes sense.
It does. And it's a lot of things to be we get wowed. We don't get wowed now as much too. That's another big thing, right? Back in the day, like for instance, Gremlins would be a good example. That'd be like a wowing thing to us. We get like wowed by like seeing these new things, right? But we just don't get that feeling, that excitement in that context as much anymore. So now when we do, it really is a game changing moment when we watch a film where it's like, okay, I haven't seen anything similar to that before, or if it wasn't based on anything like that before. So I feel like that's a lot of the magic that is kind of gone now too.
I think the last time that I can remember being like totally just blown away, terrified, the latest that it was in my life was going with a small group of friends to see The Ring in theaters when that came out. And I feel like that was a huge moment in like sort of mainstream horror when The
Yeah,
Ring came out, when they adapted from Ringu, which is also terrifying if you've ever seen the
yep,
Japanese version. But I remember that setting the stage for me. Okay, this is terrifying. Like
yeah,
this, that was like, when they started messing around with sort of genetic anomalies, people walking on the backs
yep,
of their hands and like these kind of irregular sort of body movements and pulling hair out of that kind of stuff was like, and it was also like highly stylized, right? It
yeah.
wasn't, it was shot really well. The picture was really clear. You're watching it in a movie theater. So that was terrifying for
Yeah,
sure.
and I feel like in some is as a remake too. I feel like in some of the same context, Evil Dead has sort of that had that remake magic in it too. Because there's not too many remakes I can think of. Like The Ring is one of them. That it's tough for me to say, but I think it may even surpass the original. The Ring, for instance, is
Mm,
like has that magic to it, and I think that Evil Dead sort of surpasses the original in that way. There is definitely going to be some horror fans that are going to be sending me some angry emails about that, but
mm,
I'm gonna have to take it. But that's the thing about there's certain movies now that it's a dime a dozen that really shock you. And what I liked about when I saw The Ring is the same thing I liked about when I saw Evil Dead. It took its place itself seriously within the genre, and I think it
mhm,
was really standouts. Both of them were really standouts of when they came out, and that's one thing that fascinated me and like made me love them both. And I think that when I saw The Ring when I was younger, and I saw that movie, that was like one of those movies that really got me excited about modern horror when I was a kid, right? Because when I saw that, that was one of those movies I like, oh, I don't have to watch these horror movies that came out before I was born that to get
mhm.
me shocked again. And yeah, that's it really excited. I think the genre as a whole for its time when Evil Dead came out as far as a gore goes, because we went through a period where we were just getting back to back of the same sort of jump scare horror. And then when it always goes in lulls. And then when Evil Dead came out, I thought that it was like a right away, very violent um,
Mhm,
horror film. And on top of that, I think it was the first trailer I saw with a red band, like a red band trailer, like the rated
mhm,
R trailers.
mhm,
I remember seeing
mhm,
that trailer and being like, this is like one of the first ones I saw where it was like a rated R
mhm.
trailer on YouTube, which is another thing that now, like whenever I see a movie has a red band trailer as opposed to like these horror films that are just jump scares and PG-13, that's another thing that excites me.
Yeah, definitely. They're going to be taking a step above when when they're rated R.
Yeah, and I think that if I'm remembering correctly, I believe in The Ring they showed the girl in the trailer. I could be wrong, but I believe they showed like the. I always say that so if you show the monster in the trailer, and Evil Dead did that too. If you can show the monster in the trailer of the movie, then you're in for something really crazy from the director. I always find that. Like if you have the reveal in the film, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of movies that have the monster reveal in the film, but it's going to tell you that the tension is more the thing they're trying to use to scare you. But if they can show you the flat out monster in the trailer, I'm like, ooh, they're going to do something really crazy. It's going to be dark. It's going to do something that's going to unsettle me is going to happen in the film. I can always tell that.
Yeah, one of the things about, just touching back on The Ring a little bit, that's awesome is it's an example of one of the few remakes of Asian cinema that didn't end up a total flop. One of my favorite movies is Old Boy, well, the Revenge trilogy, Old Boy, Lady Vengeance, and Sympathy for Lady Vengeance. You know, and they made that remake with Josh Brolin. I haven't seen the remake of Let the Right One In, so you can tell me if it's good or not.
It's not as good. The remake, it's better than the Old Boy remake is. Like it's better than that. Let Me In, I think it was changed. I hated that name change. Let Me In was the change, and I thought it was pretty good, but it wasn't on the same level of a remake as The Ring or even Evil Dead. It's not that like that level. I find that it's tougher to remake a foreign film into an American film and to get me as a horror fan to like it. I think that's a feat and a half. To remake an older, like an 80s film, I feel like a lot of the stance that people have on it, on why they don't like them, is nostalgia, in my humble opinion. I feel like a lot of that is like nostalgia. But to remake an absolute change a foreign film into an American film, I think a lot of the magic is lost because they Americanize it. And Americanizing a film is sometimes a strange feat to pull off. It's a strong, you have to be like quite the filmmaker to pull that off, because I feel like making anything the Americanized version of it loses a lot of its magic and charm. But
yeah, you're
sometimes it
looking through
works.
like a different cultural lens, right? So
Yeah.
much of what makes it work for North American viewers is like an element that you probably don't fully understand. And I think that's where some of the magic comes from. Some of the references that aren't obviously Japanese or Korean cinema is going to have a lot of different cultural themes than North American, right? And I think when those things are done right, they're understanding the cultural nuances and then trying their best to like maintain those. So
The one the one subgenre of horror that you could always remake no matter what culture is a cabin in the woods film. Like you can take a cabin in the woods style film like the Evil Dead and put it in any country, and you can kind of make that work anywhere. It is like one of those things that's probably what worked in favor of this remake. You can kind of put that literally anywhere in the world because everyone has an isolated place, and that kind of culturally would work anywhere, especially because it's usually like a very small cast of people too. So you can like, I could watch a Korean cabin in the woods film, or I could watch like an Indian cabin in the woods film, or a German cabin in the woods film, and I'm sure it would hit the same marks without me even having to like understand parts of their culture that would work. Right? I think that'd be very of the subgenres of horror. I think that might be the easiest one to pull off as a remake.
Yeah, because those are things that are appealing to like our basic fears, which is I think a great place to start with horror. It's got to be so strange with that weird sort of body movement style.
Yeah.
Like it's got to be so strange that it's outside of any cultural perception.
Yeah.
Or it's got to be speaking to what we all subscribe to as being like scary. Walking up the stairs, back up the stairs out of a basement.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Or going to use the outhouse in the bush and like staring down the hole before you sit down. Like, you know, there are things that are just a part of our like basic fears that I think, like you said, they're across the board scary.
Oh yeah, or Universal. There is, I'll never forget this. In the Red Band trailer for Evil Dead, this one thing I'll never forget. And they showed it in the trailer, and I was like, oh well, that doesn't matter when I see that. That's always gonna be scary. Is the scene with the X-Acto knife where Mia licks the X-Acto knife and cuts her tongue, which is such an over the top when she does it with the girlfriend. It's such an over the top thing to do that really doesn't even make sense later in the film because she talks with her tongue and it's not cut and everything like that, but it didn't matter. It didn't matter.
Also, no, it didn't matter. Anytime you spend anytime as an actor or director or anything, you spend time on set and you realize the importance of continuity. You see script supervisors doing their job, poking their head and being like, yeah, the plate wasn't there in this scene and now it's there or whatever. it kind of spoils movie watching in some ways
Yeah.
for people that work in film, because you're constantly picking that apart. And there was one scene in particular when Eric gets stabbed with the piece of glass.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure, does it break off in her hand? Because there's a huge ass piece still in his chest, but the last frame when he's bludgeoned his girlfriend to death and she's laying on the floor is her holding the piece of glass, right?
Yeah.
And
Did
then it's in
she?
his chest, so you never know. You never know.
Yeah. I wonder. The thing is with that, there was so much for me. There was so much going on in that one scene. I'd have to rewatch that because, geez, there was so much pain in that one scene. It was like pain was like a character in this movie that was like frequent because I was like, there was that one scene, yeah, where she was. Oh, I think is that the scene within the same scene of when she stabs him with the needle in the face.
Yeah.
Yeah, that. Geez, everything about that one scene. I'm like, God. I wonder if there. Yeah, I would have to go look back at that scene to see if there she was still holding a piece of glass there.
That whole movie is like paper cuts on
Yes.
steroids.
Yeah.
You know how like certain horror films do a good job of everybody listening, everybody that ever imagines a piece of paper in the like webbing of your
Oof.
fingers. We're all gonna
Yeah.
be like, oh
We can all
shit,
hear
man,
it. Yeah,
that
we can
hurt.
feel it.
Yeah, that's what that whole movie's like. That whole
Absolutely.
movie is like close-ups of really intense paper cuts.
Oh, absolutely.
Like crowbar through the fingers, like
Yeah.
needle in the eyeball.
Yeah. And it, like every single scene, it's just like, it just hurts to watch. Like it just hurts. Even when she like crashed the car and she
Mm,
bangs her head. And I was like, okay, that's like, and she like knocked herself out. I was like, okay, she probably has a concussion. And then the water in the car starts like seeping out. I was like, this, it's just the worst case scenarios. I'm like, water
mm,
starts seeping in. And then she gets into the bush and it's like prickles wrapping around her arm. And I was like, oh, that's the worst. And then after that, she gets possessed and she turns the heating of the shower up and scalds
that's
her
so
skin.
gnarly.
Oh, that was
So
hard to
gnarly.
watch. Yeah. She gets, as far as final girls go, yeah, she gets put through the ringer in such a level. One thing I appreciate about this film, actually, she gets put through the ringer in such a level that wasn't in the same context as, say, a Saw. With no respect to the Saw movies. The Saw movies, I feel, are like, they're torture porn. This one actually, every pain just kind of really stuck to the story of why it was happening. Even like the shower thing, it really
Yeah.
showed you in the book exactly why it happened, and it showed you like it had a real reason why every single pain thing happened. And
Mm,
the setup, I thought one of my favorite setups for the film was the foreshadowing of the girlfriend having to cut off her arm,
mm,
foreshadowing of that of when she had cut the beef, and it just shows you that this close up of her cutting through. I think it's like a roast beef. It's
yeah.
just well, just show you that that's there, and then the payoff of that, like 20 minutes later in the movie, after so much has happened, where she has to cut off her own arm and it doesn't even help her, was
Mm.
such a brutal thing to watch.
Yeah, another thing that I noticed too that was it's probably, partly responsible for why I had such a potty mouth as a kid, was horror films back in the day. And I don't know if it's just a testament to like the times and how storytelling has changed, but horror films back in the day weren't afraid to be dirty. And I
Yeah,
don't mean gory, I mean like weird. If you think of The Exorcist,
yeah,
there's a lot of curvy lines that come out of
yeah,
that little girl's mouth. The same thing happened in this film, and it was immediately drew me back to the early kind of more perverse sort of script writing of older films when
yeah.
she's climbing up the stairwell of the cellar and her brother's at the top of the stairs and she
Yes.
like beckons him to come down and let her suck him off or something.
Yeah, something like that. I was. I remember watching, listening to it this time because I remember seeing it the first time. Or I remember seeing it years ago, and I was like, "Oh yeah, okay, that's like so over the top." Jesus, like this time, like that's so intense. Like, and I was like thinking about what's going through his brother's mind. I think at the time in the time in the movie too, he still doesn't understand she's possessed.
Yeah,
He's still like,
yeah,
"Oh, she's just high on drugs." I'm like,
yeah.
"Jeez."
It did. No, but that's the thing is like I find that older horror films they didn't shy away from that. There was
Yeah,
more of that. This is going to be as creepy as it is gory,
yeah.
sort of thing.
And I thought that, yeah, the opening scene had that too. I can't remember where the girl's like tied to the post and she was just, where's mom? Where's mom? And the dad's like, you know where she is. She killed her. and then her slip into being demonic. She's like, I'm gonna rip out your soul, like, and she just
Yeah.
starts going off in a tirade, swearing at him. I was like, oh,
Yeah.
that's like one of my favorite
Yeah.
opening scenes for that in a horror
Yeah.
movie,
That
because
was
her
neat.
flip over is just so genuine in a sense. Yeah, it
Yeah.
felt like a possession movie on steroids itself. It just really felt like every demonic the demons in it didn't really seem like they were just moving stuff. Yeah, I felt like the demon power level though was kind of strange. Like she had enough power to summon the wind and break glass and stuff like that, and
Mm-hmm.
but then I don't know, there was a lot of the demons just walking towards them, just stabbing them with stuff just for raw pain reasons, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Is it the original Evil Dead where Bruce Campbell's in the cottage and all of the taxidermy starts laughing at him, and like the phone, everything in the house starts laughing at him, and then blood starts spewing from the walls? Do you remember that scene at
Yeah,
all?
that's in the second
That's in the
one.
second one.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. I had to rethink that. But yeah, that's in the second one. But even yeah, that movie was weird. Bruce
That movie
Campbell.
was
Bruce
terrifying.
Campbell's one of those guys that I really like because I feel like Bruce Campbell and I'm just gonna throw out names here. Bruce Campbell, Ryan Reynolds, and who's another good example? Keanu Reeves, I guess. Those are guys that could be in 1,000 bombs and then they could put out like the 1,001 movie and we'll go see it, because those guys are just seem like such nice, genuine guys that it's like it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't matter if they have a bad movie. Like it's like, oh, it doesn't matter because they seem like the nicest people ever, and they're just like they just seem like
Mm-hmm.
happy to be there sort of guys. And I'm always kind of like I'm rooting for them no matter what, no matter how
Oh
campy
yeah.
they are and things like, oh, like Ryan Reynolds has had a couple bombs, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. He could have 1,000 bombs and it would not matter. And I never blame him for them. I'm like, you know what? That was everyone else's fault but Ryan Reynolds.
Good work, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, Green Lantern.
Yeah. I'm like, you know what? That was everyone's fault but him.
Yeah.
It's funny to look back at Green Lantern too, to see like the cast of people that could like if they were to remake that now, that'd be like an A-list movie because it's got Ryan Reynolds, Blake Lively, and
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, and I'm probably, if anybody hears me saying this and recognizes me, I didn't find Green Lantern to be that terrible. Sometimes I take things. I'm
yeah,
not saying
yeah,
that it should have won an Academy Award, or that it was, it honored the comic book narrative.
yeah.
Nothing like that. But sometimes I'm in for a plate of warm shit. I don't
Yeah.
really. Sometimes I'm okay with that. I'm not above watching some garbage.
I think that Green Lantern, especially in context, I think it's on par with. I'm probably gonna get some flack for this. Some of the Marvel movies that are coming out anyway. So I'm like, it was a light, fun,
Yeah,
happy movie. I'm like,
yeah,
yeah, it was on par. But
yeah. Those
yeah,
franchises, man, that just kind of end up on autopilot. You
I'm
can make a lot of movies without really being all that good.
there's so many. That's my thing, right? Like there's so many bright, colorful, happy, same sort of conveyor belt franchises that are coming out, that when I do see a film like The Evil Dead, that's another thing though. When it came out, right, I'm like, man, I'm getting beaten to death with all these superhero movies that are the same bright family movie. And then from there, like all of the sci-fi movies became the same sort of happy movie, that like when I see a movie that's raw and has like a demonic girl yelling at her brother weird, strange sexual things, and she's cutting herself with like cutting her tongue with an exact knife. When I see a movie that's that far away from the typical movies we see, because I feel like we don't get as many rated R movies now too.
That's what made Joker such a
Oh,
success,
absolutely.
right? Like, I
Yeah,
mean, my hope is that, and I'm not somebody that needs wildly over the top violence to get a point across, but to see the superhero, or in this case, like supervillain, but also somewhat superhero, depending
yeah.
on how you look at it, to see that shift in the way that process is carried out. I mean, I hope that will spur, a kind of more edgy side of a lot of these different films.
It feels like it is, and it feels like a lot of the genre is kind of aiming towards horror mainstream. I feel that I'm seeing a lot of modern films now will have a horror scene in them, which is
Mm.
really fascinating. Like Aquaman was a good example. When I watched that, and it was directed by a very great horror director, James Wan. And when you watch that movie, there's a scene in it where he dives underwater and goes to like this underwater world of the whole movie's underwater. I understand that, where he goes to the Tretch, which is where these weird half man, half fish creatures that look like they're straight from hell are. And I'm like, even that was like, it was a straight up horror scene. And then like, I think months later, like, oh yeah, we're going to put out a horror movie of that one scene. I'm like, well, you better, like, you've got one of the, like the greatest, like modern horror directors working on it. I'm like, you better put out a horror movie from that. And I'm hoping that, like, I feel that there's a lot of an influence from horror. My one problem being is that I'm hoping that everything doesn't just turn into like a PG-13 version of it, though, because I feel like they're trying to aim towards that too. They're like, hey, let's just make some more light horror and try to mix the genre of like those happy, bright Marvel movies, but trying to also make it to add horror elements. And I don't want that to be the thing. I just want more.
Yeah.
Yeah, like you said, I don't need the point across of it to be gruesomely violent, but I do like that in context too. Like, I feel like there's more of a dramatic acting aspect from that.
We need more gritty storytelling, full
Absolutely.
stop. The trouble with perpetuating the kind of filmmaking that we have right now, and it's not all of it, there's this prevailing theory that there's no good music, there's no good movies. Well,
Yeah.
there are, but they're just saturated with shit. There's a lot of shit that's made.
Yes.
But if you're somebody that enjoys movies, there's great ways to find good movies. They're still out there. But I think, what some of this discussion is if movies and television shows and film and all art, if it's to serve its purpose of being entertaining, but also a way to challenge people's ideas and to push the envelope of different sort of ideologies, then we have to make a shift in how that's done. We have to shake things up, because we could spend the next 100 years you know making superhero movies that don't push the envelope, and sure, people will be entertained, but that's the trouble, is it cannot be all about entertainment, or
Yeah.
else we'll just turn into like walking potato chips. I
Yeah.
think there's
Yeah.
a real opportunity. We have better special effects than ever. We have better practical effects than ever. We have like access to the largest pool of talent we've ever had, right?
Absolutely.
There's no excuses for us to not be making cutting edge.
And a great understanding too, right? Like, there's now you can watch films that are made with a lower budget that not outperform financially usually, because now those big conveyor belt blockbusters make like a billion movies, $1 billion. But I find that there's films that you can make for like a $5 million or $17 million or whatever it is, that seem to not only push the envelope, just be more interesting, and they look great now. You can make a movie with like a $1 million, and it'll just look great now, because we also have access to better cameras and just filmmaking in general. I think that they just have an aesthetic that they can just make it easier now for a lot of people to even make that.
Totally, man. I mean, I'm kind of biased. I'm a little obsessed with it, but Midsummer,
Great
like,
movie.
what an insane, stylistically,
Yeah.
so insane, like shot so beautifully, and everything about that movie, it was like amazing, amazing acting, brilliant acting. Cinematography was insane. The nuanced storytelling, like it was all just on point for me. And for me, that's like a good example of the kind of movies I want to see. And it doesn't have to all be psychological thrillers, but those
Yeah.
elements.
But that's the whole thing too. Like, I feel there's a lot of people that are just purists when it comes to the genre of horror, and I feel like movies like Midsummer, and movies like The Witch, or movies like Hereditary, or a lot of modern horror, I feel like some of the best acting's coming out of it, some of the best storytelling's coming out of it, and some of like the best ideas coming out of it, and for such a low budget. Like, I would rather have movies like that, or I'd even have like more pure horror movies. It doesn't really matter. I'd rather have any of those movies get the budget than like the $100 million budget to make like 10 or 20 of those movies, as opposed to one superhero movie that I'll probably forget by the time I'm in the parking lot from. That's an old sentence, because there's not movie theaters anymore. But by the time I've like stepped away the movie, you know what I mean? Like, for Train to Busan was a good example. Did you see that one from Korea?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good example of like a zombie movie that stuck with me after, right? As opposed to a lot of the movies I see I will get sucked into seeing like a Fast and Furious movie, but I'll forget about that movie, what it's about, by the time I've gotten outside. And I feel like films like Midsommar and a lot of the new art house style horror movies always seem to stick with me more so than anything else that I've seen that year.
Well, yeah, because if you're anything like me, the reason that that happens is I don't know how I feel at the end,
Yeah,
and that to me is the best way to like end somebody's experience of watching a movie.
yeah,
Is I don't know if I hated the villain or loved them. I don't know. Do you know what I mean? Because
yeah,
that's the most accurate representation of humanity. We're never one thing. We're not good. We're not bad. We're not somewhere in between. We're kind of a little bit of everything, even the most despicable people. And I think that's when great storytelling happens, is when, the most despicable people can become loved and vice versa, or somewhere in between.
yeah.
And like, for
I
sure.
also like not knowing who the hero is in a lot of these
Yeah.
films. That's a big aspect for me. I feel that a lot of another problem I'm going to have. I feel like I'm slamming on the superhero genre a lot, but it's just the easiest one to pick on. I feel that those films, that a lot of superhero films, they're just point A to point B very quickly. As far as like the villain's always bad, the hero's always good. But films that there's a lot of gray area in a lot of modern horror, which I really like, and even in a very by the numbers horror like The Evil Dead, I find that from the beginning to the end, that there's such a changeover for who you think the hero is the brother, and then from how it ends with Mia saving, well, not saving him, but Mia defeating the demon. I
Mhm.
I feel like that was like such a beginning, like such a development from her being kind of meek in the beginning, and then just going through this character arc to being a completely different person in the end. And I feel that's one of those things that a movie that's so simple is able to pull off, like simple in concept is able to pull off. But these bigger budget films just have struggles having any gray area. It's always just like, oh, this person's good, this person's bad, and that's it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably just more of the like leaning into what producers and filmmakers think will. I think some of them are willing to take the risk of what they're writing and how the movie unfolds not being that digestible. Certain stuff is meant to just be very pleasant,
Yeah,
on the nose kind of. I'm receptive to the story. I don't like that guy because he's bad, and I don't, and that's a formula. That's not
yeah,
like there's nothing inherently wrong with it. It's a formula, right? But I think if cinema is to continue to evolve, we have to throw the formula out
yeah,
a lot of the
yeah.
time. Have you seen the movie The Square?
No.
So yeah, I mean, I won't get into it, but
Okay.
Midsummer is another good example of that,
Yeah,
right? It doesn't follow the formula, but somehow it's effective in being eerie and sticks with you.
yeah,
And I like movies that do a good job of taking the risk of, because it is a risk when you don't follow the formula, whatever
yeah.
that formula is. It is a risk, and I like when that's not being followed, and you end up succeeding. So
Well, it's interesting too because Midsummer, The Witch, and Hereditary, and a list of other great films are all distributed by A24. And I feel
mhm.
that every A24 distributed film, even like their non-horror ones like Moonlight, there are these brilliant movies that when I watch the trailer, I don't know what I'm in for, but I know I'm going to like it. Not just because
Mhm.
it looks, their films that they distribute always look gorgeous, but it's not just because of that, and not because of the talented actors. But when I watch the trailer, I'm already I know the risks of that distribution agency takes, or agency distribution company takes. That I know I'm going to like it, and I feel that even after I saw Midsummer, even if I watch the trailer again, I'm still like, oh, this wasn't that clear what I was in for. But emotionally, once I saw the film, I knew what it was about. And I feel like that a lot of the bigger budget films now, from the trailer, I can predict everything that's going to happen. Number one, and
Yeah,
number
can we
two,
just take a minute to talk about how fucking blown out trailers are now? Can we shrink that a bit?
it's
Back in the
insane.
day, it was like 28 seconds of something you could never put a story together with.
No,
And now I find it harder to pick a movie because I feel like if I watch the full trailer, I
yeah.
basically watched the movie now.
And there's
Like
five
like
trailers. There's five trailers. We get five of them.
yeah,
Easy.
yeah. So you can pretty much watch the movie, including the director's cut, by
Oh,
watching all five trailers.
oh, you can't because they released the teaser trailer. And then after the teaser trailer, we get the official trailer. Then after the official trailer, we get the international trailer, and then we get a TV spots, usually about 3 TV spots that are all different, and then there's the final trailer, which just That's it. That's it. That's the whole movie. I'm like, that's it. Obviously, we're not forced to see aren't forced to see them all, but a lot of them are just like, they're just there. They're
Yeah,
just
but
like there.
you shouldn't even give it to people.
No,
You shouldn't
absolutely
even.
not.
Don't do that. Shame on you.
I
Shame
like
on
being
you,
confused though.
trailer
Like when I see a
makers.
trailer,
Yeah,
when
yeah.
I'm like confused, I'm like, okay, I'm confused. I don't know what's going to
Yeah,
happen.
give
I'm
me a trailer
excited.
I don't understand. Give me a
Yeah.
trailer I don't understand, uh, because it's either too convoluted or it's not long enough.
Yes.
Then you got
Yes.
me. Just give me enough. Give me enough. Maybe like flash a nipple in there. I don't know if it's a man's nipple or a woman's nipple.
Could be
Boom.
anything.
You got me right there. Boom. Saw a nipple. Boom. I'm watching.
Another one that was interesting was Green Knight. Have you seen the trailer for Green Knight?
No.
No? Okay, Green Knight is an A24 movie, and that trailer, I don't really know what the movie's about, but I'm very excited. Like,
I love it.
very excited. I know it's about a knight, and there's monsters in there somewhat, but it's a short trailer too. And the movie was supposed to already be out, but obviously we're in hell world, and movies haven't been released. But yeah, movies were supposed to be out, and they just released one trailer though. That was it. But I guess because they didn't have a release date, they just drop that. And I hope that when they do release it, if they surprise release it on us, just drop it, put it on like video on demand so we can watch it, and just don't release another trailer.
That's another thing that's worth mentioning about Evil Dead is by modern film standards, even like seven years ago or so when that came out, an hour and 24 minutes, I think it is. That's a short movie.
Yeah. Yeah.
That I think that's why it's so blast off right from the get-go, because you don't see many movies that are under like hour 45 at the minimum now. Like
Yeah.
most movies are over 2 hours now.
Yeah, and it told its story well, and like there was talks about if they're going to do like another one or whatever. But I'm like, I don't think it needs it. If they just kept it like exactly how it is, I'm like, I don't think I need any continuation on that. I'm like, I'm fine. I definitely don't need years later of Mia. I wouldn't even know how they would even try to do a sequel to that, because the sequel to the remake was obviously, or sorry, the sequel to the original was obviously so different than the first one that I'm like, I
She's
don't
still
really.
addicted to drugs. She just has a chainsaw
She
arm
should
now.
definitely be addicted to drugs still after that incident. Like all of her friends died in that cabin, and she's sole survivor. She should
Just
definitely
her
be.
doing lines. She's strained all that coke out of the well, and she's doing lines off of her chainsaw arm.
He's just going hard. Well, thing is with that movie is like, would you even know what happened? Like, would you? Because all your friends died, and you were there going through withdrawals, and what you like, you don't have one other witness to be like, hey, there was demons. You weren't
Maybe
losing
it's
your
like
mind.
an allegory for drug abuse. You're going to end up chopping your arm off, Requiem for a Dream style, and your coke is all diluted in the bottom of a creepy well, and everybody's dead around you. That's pretty much drug addiction.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, it visually like does make, and it was like a battle for her to get clean at the end. She literally
Yeah,
died again too, and just like they
she
mentioned,
did.
because they mentioned she died originally, and she had to get brought back to life, and she
And there
died
was a demon
again.
inside of her, man. That shit's Christian propaganda, I think. Actually, it's
They
like,
should put
you do
that.
drugs, you're going to end up possessed, you're going to kill off all your friends, and you're going to cut your arm off, and you're going to be all alone.
If they showed me that when I was 5 years old, that would sell me way more than a Dare commercial. Those Dare like don't do drug commercials. This
Melting
one,
into a couch.
oh yeah, that like those were just so strange. Like I don't know what I'm seeing.
It's like
This
a
was
guy that
clear.
turns into a fried egg. I
Yeah.
think there's one where a guy like literally melts into a sunny side up egg because he smoked a joint.
Oh yeah. There was one where what was it? It was something that was talking to him, like an ornament was talking to him. It was like, it's like, you're high right now. This is talking to you. I was like, what are they? What? Like so confused. My favorite was, and I can't remember who, if they were a famous actor at the time, it was just a really 90s commercial where it's like, this is your brain on drugs. And she smashes the egg. Do you remember this? And she just like destroys
Yeah.
everything. This is your house. Jeez, this is so violent. I just remember, like, I can't remember if she was like supposed to be famous at the time. I want to say it's like the actor she reminded me of, but I know it's not her, is Rose McGowan. Like it reminded me of like a Rose McGowan type actress. And she was just breaking everything in the house. And I never forgot that commercial because it was like so odd. And I don't
Yeah.
really know who was behind that, but I feel like they just gave up on those commercials after a while.
But the reality is those. I don't think those commercials are effective. Fear mongering, kind of, you're going to turn into a fried egg. And I'm not somebody that advocates for like children using drugs
Yeah.
at all. I know that strategy certainly didn't work for me.
No.
Certainly
No.
didn't work for me. And I don't think it really works in general. There's got to be a different way to approach those things. And maybe
Yeah.
horror films are a vehicle for that.
Well, I think that horror films are a good vehicle for approaching a lot of things, right? They're the new Grimm's fairy tales, right?
Mhm.
Grimm's fairy tales were like just kind of made from, obviously, when the Grimm brothers were like, we're getting all these different stories, they're all just cautionary tales. And a lot of horror is a cautionary tale. The strange one about Evil Dead is usually these cautionary tales have more of a realism to them. It's like, oh, you shouldn't like trust this person, and that's the reason. Oh, you should lock your doors. But this one was like, don't read a demonic book, what I guess would be. I mean, they went to lengths to read that book you shouldn't have read.
Yeah,
It
he
was
definitely was like, what, I think they skipped a beat there with how just total reckless abandon, like opening up the barbed wire wrapped, this book is made of flesh. He
absolutely,
just jumped right into it, no
absolutely,
question. He wasn't like, hey guys, you think I should read this? Another thing that I noticed in the film that you don't see in many horror films is a lot of the time they order the way that people are killed off based off of their character.
yeah,
And I feel like nobody in that film was free from, like, obviously they went after the girl being the most vulnerable at the beginning, Mia.
yeah,
But there was no like hierarchy of like, okay, we're gonna kill off this guy, and this is the guy who's gonna get his dick fucking eaten off because he's a perv or something
yeah,
like that.
yeah,
Because
yeah.
they used to do that in. Forgive me for using curse words. My
You're
manners are
completely
good.
okay. It's completely fine.
Okay, but yeah, that was like something that it has been like kind of an archetype in horror for a long time. Is this is a bad guy, so it will
Yeah,
make sense to you when we kill him off first or last, depending on
yeah.
like, do you know what I mean?
There
But
was no
that
bad
movie
guy
was
in this. That was
no,
fascinating. That was the thing I wrote down too. There was no
everybody was
bad
trying
guy.
to be the hero.
Yeah, everyone was nice. They were fed up, but I'm like, they were rightfully fed up. They were like exhausted and everything that was going on. But they were like
Mhm.
all very good people, if anything. Who's a really unsung good person? The girlfriend of the brother was a very good person because I'm like, she seemed like she's never met these people. She's never met his sister. And it's like she got roped into they didn't say how long they've been dating, but it was like a very strange thing to
Yeah,
rope her into. It's like, hey, do you want to come to a cabin to get my sister clean with a bunch of other strangers you've never met? And the
yeah.
cabin is also terrible for some reason. Like the cabin itself is a terrible place to
That
stay.
thing has not been lit. They're like, man, mom would have been pissed. Nobody has been in this cabin since that woman was burnt in like Salem witch trials.
Oh, absolutely.
Nobody's been in that cabin in a long time. And I love that it was, yeah, just turn the turn the electricity on, we'll run some water. Like
Oh
this
yeah.
cabin is got the plumbing and the electrical of a modern cabin, but
Why would
nobody's
they
been in there in
stay
100
there? Like
years.
I got like the connection to like their younger like selves like staying there, but I was like,
The world's
why
worst
would you
rehab
go there?
center.
Yeah, exactly. Why would you? She's like, it reeks of here. When they saw like the animals dead in the bed, like, oh well, that's fine. We'll just still stay here. And I was like, man, that is horror movie logic. The place was not up to code, I don't think. And
Yeah,
like,
totally. That is totally condemned. And also, yeah, on the topic of horror movie logic, I mean, I think that's kind of a stretch for some people. It's like, I find myself, even as somebody that enjoys horror, watching those movies being like, yo, you had all that energy 5 seconds ago. Why are you crawling through the rain right
yeah,
now? Get up and run. Or Mia's brother being like, remember all those cats? Maybe it's like a weird feral cat disease. No, dude. No, you had all the reasons to like know that this was some paranormal demon
yeah.
shit way before. Nobody would ever say that.
Yeah, and the strange thing too was just no one used the internet that whole movie. I'm just noticing that
Nobody
now.
even checked for a signal, man.
Not one time. That's the first modern horror movie where they've never checked for the internet. And
They
it's
never
weird.
Googled
Not one time. And it's weird because I've seen the movie a couple times, and this is like the first time within this conversation that I even noticed that
it.
no one checked the internet or looked up anything. Oh, I thought one thing was fascinating was the overconfidence of the nurse. The
Yeah,
overconfidence of her was a really fascinating to the point that she got mad at
yeah.
what it was a really strange thing with it first, like when the girl was like, yeah, you're the doctor, she's like, it's nurse, and like that was a touchy subject, like nurses in like a super important job, like
Yeah.
why are you mad about, like, it's a simple mistake, and I'm like, nurse is a phenomenal job. I thought it was really fascinating. She's like, oh sorry. I'm like, what are you saying sorry for? It was like a
Yeah.
weird dynamic. And then like later when and she was like a great nurse too, like patched them all up. And it was funny too that her ultimately dying first was fascinating to me because I'm like, man, she could have helped out so much.
Yeah,
She
dude,
didn't
all
die
the
first.
triage, all the sutures and bandages, man.
She was easily the most useful character ever, except for
Eric,
the sorry, go ahead.
oh, I was just gonna say Eric got by okay with some duct tape
Oh
though.
yeah.
In that scene when he stays dressing up that massive chest stab wound with a piece of duct tape and like some folded up Kleenex.
He was that. It's funny that how much the brother was just MacGyver. He must be the best mechanic in the world. He made when he made the what do you call it to get her heart going again? The defibrillator. Made a defibrillator with the two needles. Yeah, I'll take it. You know what? That's not how that works at all, but all right.
I think I just like cut that out of my mind because it was so ridiculous. The double syringe.
Double syringe, but on top of that, through
Hooked
her
up to a
clothes
car
for some
battery.
reason.
Yeah.
Through clothes, and I didn't get that. I didn't understand if you're listening to this, and these are all things that I'm saying about the movie that sound like I'm discrediting the movie, but I loved the movie, and these are things that actually highlighted the movie for me. I don't know why he put her in the red dress, what the concept of that was. Like, it had no real purpose for him to put her in a dress before putting the syringes in her chest. Remember that?
Yeah.
But for the look of it, it was
great.
worth it. I was like, she looks so badass when she was in the dress and had her arm like cut off. I was like, okay, it made no sense why he put her in the dress before he did this thing, like just rechanged her clothes. But
well, that's the thing I think you risk when you're running at an hour and 25 minutes.
Yeah.
Is like those details you just can't include them. I mean, personally, had I been a part of the movie and no bashing of the probably brilliant people behind it, I wouldn't do stuff like that. It looks great, but if you can't find a way to explain it, you end up it ends up being in a podcast.
Yeah.
It ends up being in a podcast with some guy going, man, that looked really great, but I don't understand.
Yeah, it made no sense. And I watched it and I was like looking at it, I was like, I really wonder why the dress, but it looks cool. Where was the dress too? I didn't understand that. Where he got that from? Was it in her stuff?
This pristine looking dress of mom's that was just like a prom dress that was just chilling in this absolutely, beaten up cabin.
A pristine looking dress before he buried her alive too was the thing.
That to me, it's like pretty understood that like it takes a lot to stop a demon in a horror film like that, and that felt too easy. It was like, I'm just gonna lay her down and put a Ziploc freezer bag around her head and throw a couple scoops of dirt on her head.
Right? There is a lot of the horror logic that went into this that I forget. The exposition too, by the way, and I may have mentioned that in the beginning. The exposition of just them yelling out who they were, pretty much, and yelling out why they were there. But I was like you said, because it's such a shorter movie, it completely worked for me. Like I was like, oh, okay, cool. I'm caught up. I know your dynamics. I know that you two guys aren't friends anymore, but you used to be friends. Cool. Caught up. I'm in. Let's watch the movie.
And yeah, I think that might be the sort of obstacle between maybe people who don't watch a lot of horror or that stylistically that type of film. Like I think that gets in the way. Like you don't lower your expectations with a film like that. Mm-hmm. You have to alter your expectations, which I think is probably more easily achieved. If you've seen the original Evil Dead and you go and watch this movie will, I think, be more fun for you to watch because you understand that it's stylistically and in many other ways supposed to be like an homage to that original film, right? Yeah. And I think people roll into something like that and they don't. I think that they're just not approaching it the right way, and it might not be as entertaining because of it. So
yeah, and there's a lot of gore that I feel that there's people I could not show this movie to because there's a lot of gore in it. Like, it's there's some things that like we grew up watching horror movies in a sense that like didn't really gross out, and there was like more of a fun element to it. But yeah, there's definitely some things in this that you couldn't unsee if you don't watch horror movies. Yeah,
totally.
Well, we've talked about some great modern horror things here, and especially about this movie, Evil Dead. I almost call it The Evil Dead. Let's just wrap it up here. Just a quick question. Which movie would you have preferred to be in? Which one would you have liked to star in? Would you, if you had the option, you could choose to be in either movie, which movie would you like to star in? And would you like to star as a new character, or would you like to take place of an existing character?
In the
Out of the
Evil
two
Dead and
movies.
Evil Dead.
Yeah.
Um, I think I probably would have loved to have been in the original, and albeit probably not doing the same job or as good of a job. Like, I think it would have been cool to play Bruce Campbell's character, or
Ooh.
perhaps a different character. But I
Yeah.
feel like the opportunities, it all goes back to that conversation about like we're not wooed the same way.
Yeah.
And I think that actors are received by the acting community the same way now. You can be a blip now, maybe more than you were then.
Yeah.
You know, if you had your name attached to some of those early projects, it almost sort
Well,
of
only
elevated you because of that.
only Bruce Campbell really broke out from that, and Sam Raimi, I suppose. Like, we're the only
Yeah.
two, like those two just really broke out from that film. But that's a great '80s film.
Yeah, and it would have been so fun to be around all those, ridiculous practical effects and stuff.
Oh, 100%. Budget was just a lot lower too, so that would have just been a very fun, intimate set to be on too.
Totally. And I think for people that are watching something like the Evil Dead remake, again, one of the things that kind of spoils things for you as somebody who works in film is that movie magic happens in post production.
Yeah.
When you're shooting on the day, it doesn't matter how eerie you make it look. When you're an actor on set and you're supposed to be cutting your tongue open with an X-Acto knife, if you're like a guy holding a boom during that experience, it just looks weird. It doesn't look as scary.
Yeah.
And I guess what I'm getting at is that there was so much work in that film around makeup between takes. This is where you hack open this guy's hand, and we're
Yeah.
going to shoot it with 3 different camera angles, and we're going to have to redo makeup like every time. So that's like super impressive, which would have been how much work went into all the makeup and set decorating and stuff like that. That's wild.
Honestly, and not in the same, obviously, not in the same legacy or scope. So please don't send me hate mail. But I felt like that Jane Levy's character, the torment she kind of went through, reminded me of Leonardo DiCaprio's character in The Revenant. Like, I'm like, as far as like the torment she went through as a character, I'm like, geez, you went through the rigor of this. Like, you got buried alive. You dragged yourself through like the wetness. Like, she was coughing up the like white bile. Yeah, she went through everything in this movie. I'm like, that would have been a brutal time to. So much special effects was just done on her as just one character, let alone everyone else that went through everything else.
Mm-hmm.
So with that, I'll just close the show. It was absolutely great talking to you. I'm sure we're going to do this again. I'm sure we're going to do another movie again. I want to do one for Suspiria coming up, talking about the remake of that. So everyone that's listening, if you have your time, I'd recommend watching that movie. And Fletcher, hopefully you'll be back to speak with me about that movie.
That would be great. Thanks so much for having me, Joel. Thanks, everybody, for having a listen. And if you've not, get out there and watch both The Evil Dead and Evil Dead. Great films. And keep an open mind. They're fun.
They are fun films. And this has been the No Stranger to Horror podcast by Joel H. Brewster from West Coast Strange. See you later, Fletcher.
Thanks, brother. Take care.
You too.